I want you to really sit with this for a second, because what happened in that hearing is the kind of thing you assume only happens in authoritarian regimes, not the United States. But here we are. Congress just heard sworn testimony from U.S. citizens, actual citizens, describing how masked, unidentified federal agents slammed them to the ground, handcuffed them, denied them phone calls, blocked them from lawyers, and literally disappeared them for days. And the fact that we even have to say that out loud is insane. Absolutely insane. Let's be extremely clear about what's happening here. This was not an isolated mistake. This wasn't a confusion, a mix-up, or whatever euphemism the Trump defense machine is going to trot out on Fox News tonight. This was a coordinated, intentionally opaque, intentionally brutal series of raids carried out in Los Angeles by federal officers who, and this is the part that should make your blood boil, refused to show badges, refused to identify themselves, and operated like a paramilitary force that believed it was accountable to no one. If you're watching this and feeling like you're taking crazy pills, you are not alone. Because at this hearing, residents described being grabbed off sidewalks, thrown into vans, and held in detention centers where they weren't allowed to call their families, weren't allowed to speak to a lawyer, and weren't even given water. In the United States of America. Let that sink in.
And guess what? It wasn't just undocumented immigrants. It wasn't even just immigrants. U.S. citizens were detained. Citizens, people with passports, people with social security numbers, people who were born here, people who were supposed to have the full protection of the Constitution, the very document these guys pretend to treat like the Bible. And yet they were shackled, hauled into a federal building, and told nothing. And honestly, it's pathetic. It's pathetic that we're even having this conversation in 2025. But here's what makes this even more surreal. Congress was stunned, not because they didn't know raids were happening. They knew. Everyone knew. But they were stunned because this is the first time they've heard the full truth directly from the people who lived it. They heard about a mother whose kids cry every night wondering if their father is coming home. They heard about a priest who now locks the church gates 15 minutes into Mass because he's terrified agents will storm in. They heard about community centers where attendance has dropped by nearly half because people genuinely believe they could be taken at any moment. And the Trump administration, they're pretending nothing happened. They're insisting these raids were professional, necessary, focused on criminals. Really? Criminals? Because last I checked, getting groceries or walking to work or recording a video isn't a crime. Here is the reality they don't want you to see. These raids were a test run, a trial balloon, a demonstration of power. Masked agents, no badges, no rules. This is what happens when you build an immigration system designed not for safety, not for justice, but for fear.
And that's why this hearing mattered. Because for once, the truth wasn't coming from the administration, or from sanitized press releases, or from vague statements. It came from the people who were thrown face down on the asphalt. What makes this even more infuriating is that the evidence isn't vague. It's not theoretical. It's not he said, she said. It's documented. It's time-stamped. It's corroborated. The people who testified didn't come in with emotional anecdotes detached from reality. They came in with dates, locations, descriptions of agents, medical paperwork, legal filings, and in some cases literal footage from the moments the raids took place. Footage that shows masked officers refusing to identify themselves. Footage that shows bystanders being shoved away as they try to film what is clearly a government operation in public spaces. Footage that shows citizens being removed in handcuffs while pleading to call their families. And you know how Congress reacted? With the exact kind of stunned silence you get when the truth finally bulldozes through months of lies. Because for months, Trump and his people insisted these raids were clean, professional, lawful, targeted. But the testimonies obliterated that narrative completely. There's no spinning a woman being thrown to the pavement by an agent with no badge. There's no spinning a citizen being pepper sprayed for literally filming a public event. There's no spinning a detainee being denied the right to call anyone for 48 hours. You can't slap a law and order sticker on that and pretend it's justice. Let's talk specifics.
One witness, a U.S. citizen, described being near 9th and Main when a masked officer slammed her face first into the concrete, cuffed her, and shoved her into a van. No questioning, no explanation, no warning. She was held at MDC, the Metropolitan Detention Center, a federal facility, for days. She asked for a lawyer. She asked to call her family. She asked for medical attention. She was ignored. Do you know what her charges were? Nothing. She was released without charges, but the trauma stays, the record stays, the experience stays. And the administration's excuse? We're focusing on criminals. Really? What crime did she commit? Walking? And the worst part is, they know exactly what they're doing. When federal agents cover their faces and refuse to show badges, that's not an accident, that's a strategy. That's what you do when you want plausible deniability, when you want people to be unsure who grabbed them, when you want communities living in a constant fog of fear, where anyone could be a target and no one is safe. That is not law enforcement. That is intimidation. That is psychological warfare. And they're doing it in American cities. Then there's the priest, a Catholic priest, who testified that attendance at his parish has dropped by almost half because families are terrified of going out in public. He said he now locks the gates 15 minutes after Mass begins, not because he wants to, but because he doesn't trust that masked agents won't burst through the doors. Imagine that. Imagine being so afraid of your own government that you lock your church during worship. And these are the same people claiming they're defending religious liberty? Give me a break.
We also heard from legal advocates who described conditions inside detention facilities. Overcrowding to the point where rooms built for 12 held 50 or 60 people. People in chemotherapy, people in dialysis, people who needed medication to survive, all held without proper medical care. One advocate said federal officers used basic human needs, water, bathroom access, and phone calls as leverage to make people give up their cases, as if trauma and dehydration are legal strategies, as if cruelty is a feature, not a bug. Let's not forget the lawsuits. Multiple civil rights organizations filed suits arguing these raids violated constitutional protections, not just for immigrants, but for citizens. The patterns described in those lawsuits match exactly what residents testified to: unlawful detentions, arrests without reasonable suspicion, invasive interrogations, and systematic denial of due process. And it's not like these lawsuits exist in a vacuum. Courts already issued temporary injunctions on parts of the raids because the evidence of misconduct was so glaring that judges had to step in. And yet the administration pretended nothing was wrong. Everything is under control. Sure, under control in the same way a dumpster fire is contained because the flames haven't reached the parking lot yet. But here's the most damning piece of this entire puzzle: the data. Representative Roberto Garcia launched an oversight immigration enforcement dashboard, a public, evidence-based index cataloging every credible report of misconduct during these raids. It tracks use of force, detentions, deportations, and whether each incident occurred in a sensitive location like a church or school. Incidents involving U.S. citizens are flagged. And guess what? There are a lot of flags. And yet the administration keeps insisting these people are lying. But the data doesn't lie. The dashboard doesn't lie. The medical records don't lie. The dismissed cases don't lie. The videos don't lie. The trauma doesn't lie. The real question is, why this level of secrecy? Why the masks? Why the refusal to identify officers? Why the denials, even when the evidence is overwhelming? And the answer, as always, is that transparency destroys them. If the public saw the truth in real time, if they saw officers snatching citizens off sidewalks, the administration's entire narrative about order, security, and criminal aliens would fall apart instantly. So they hide, they obfuscate, they deny, they pretend these testimonies are exaggerations. They blame leftists, activists, media hysteria. It's the same tired playbook every time. But facts have a way of punching through propaganda. And in that hearing room, every single carefully crafted talking point from Trump's team crumbled, because when a mother stands in front of Congress and says her children cried themselves to sleep asking if their father is ever coming home, there is no counter-argument. When a woman describes being shackled for no reason other than being Latina in the wrong place at the wrong time, there is no "but actually." When a priest describes fearing his church as a target, there is no law and order justification left. The truth is loud, painfully loud, and yet the administration's response is to double down, to insist these raids were essential. Essential, as if kidnapping citizens without charges is some sort of public service, as if disappearing people into detention centers is just another Tuesday, as if trauma is a metric of success. Make no mistake, this isn't incompetence, it's intent. It's a deliberate attempt to instill fear so widespread, so paralyzing, that entire communities retreat into silence.
Congress heard the truth. They didn't just see numbers. They saw faces. They heard voices crack. They watched witnesses tremble as they relived the worst moments of their lives. And you could see it on the faces of the members. The horror, the disbelief, the anger. Because this wasn't partisan theater. This wasn't political messaging. This was reality, raw, unfiltered, documented reality, ripping through months of lies. And now that the truth is public, the administration has one problem they can't solve with spin. The receipts exist. Every contradiction, every excuse, every denial looks absurd when held up against actual testimony and actual evidence. They wanted a clean narrative about cracking down on criminals. They got a congressional record full of terrorized citizens, traumatized families, and a city living in fear of masked federal agents. They wanted control. What they got is accountability. And this is where we have to stop pretending this is an isolated situation. Because what happened in Los Angeles, the masked agents, the unmarked vans, the dragged away citizens, the secrecy, the denials, is not a glitch in the system. It is the system. It's part of a long, deliberate pattern of using fear as a political weapon. And if you think that sounds extreme, you're not paying attention to the last decade of American politics. Let's walk through the pattern, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Trump's entire political project has always relied on one thing: creating an enemy, an other, a group to blame. It's been Muslims, it's been immigrants, it's been journalists, it's been Antifa, it's been LGBTQ people, it's been teachers, it's been librarians. The target shifts, the strategy never does. And immigration? Immigration is his favorite one because it lets him merge fear, racism, and the illusion of strength into one politically explosive cocktail. He gets to look tough while doing the least courageous thing a leader can do, picking on the people with the least power.
Remember 2016? The bad hombre speech? The Muslim ban? The promise to build a wall that Mexico would magically pay for? Those weren't policy proposals. Those were fear signals. Those were pick-a-side warnings. Those were lines drawn in the sand. And once he realized how much applause that rhetoric generated at rallies, he doubled down. Then he tripled down. Then he built an entire political identity around the idea that immigrants, regardless of status, regardless of background, regardless of reality, are a threat. And the pattern only escalates. Family separation wasn't an accident. It wasn't poor implementation. It was a strategy designed to terrorize parents into giving up asylum claims. They said the quiet part out loud in court filings. They knew children would suffer. They knew parents would break. And they did it anyway, because cruelty has become the point. Then came the tear gassing of asylum seekers at the border, the cages, the reports of sexual assault in detention facilities, the forced hysterectomies, the deaths from medical neglect. Every time something horrific surfaced, the administration denied it, minimized it, or blamed the victims. But every time the same logic was at play: dehumanize the target group, normalize extreme tactics, deny accountability, repeat. So why would the LA raids be any different? They aren't. In fact, they're worse, because now the tactics used at the border have crept into American cities, into neighborhoods, into places where citizens live, work, and pray. This is the authoritarian creep. This is how democracies erode, slowly, quietly, under the guise of security.
Think about the masks, the refusal to show badges, the grabbing of bystanders. These are not immigration tactics, these are intimidation tactics. This is how Venezuela did it, how Hungary did it, how Turkey did it, how Russia still does it. You start by making a group of people so afraid of the government that they stop public life altogether. Kids skip school, parents avoid hospitals, workers stop going to their jobs, churches lock their doors.
The community becomes invisible, which is exactly what authoritarian leaders want, because invisible communities have no political power. This is what Trump world thrives on: silence, compliance, fear. And it's not new. It's the same strategy he used with the DOJ, the FBI, the State Department, and even the CDC. If an institution can't be bent to his will, he discredits it. If it can be bent, he weaponizes it. And immigration enforcement? That's been his favorite weapon from day one. Remember when he pardoned Sheriff Joe Arpaio? That wasn't a random act of loyalty, it was a message. Arpaio broke the law to racially profile people. He was held in contempt of court. Trump rewarded him. Why? Because Arpaio proved he was willing to use the force of government to target the right people. And for Trump, that's loyalty. That's the blueprint. Now, look at the LA raids through that lens. Masked agents, no badges, no accountability, people disappearing without due process. It's the exact dynamic Arpaio pioneered, scaled up to a federal level. And look at the timing. Every time Trump faces political pressure, every time a scandal emerges, every time he takes a legal hit, he turns to immigration. He knows it fires up the base. He knows it gets media attention. He knows it triggers fear. It's not enforcement. It's distraction. It's spectacle. It's a show of force meant to tell his supporters, don't worry, I'm still tough. And while we're talking patterns, remember the Lafayette Square incident? Peaceful protesters tear-gassed for a Bible photo op, people arrested violently for standing on public streets. That wasn't about safety, that was about power. The LA raids follow the same script: escalate, intimidate, deny, lie. The administration keeps claiming these operations are about removing dangerous criminals, but if that were true, why weren't the agents required to wear visible identification? Why were bystanders grabbed? Why were churches raided? Why were citizens detained? Why were people denied phone calls? Why were lawyers blocked? Why were medical needs ignored? Because it's never been about criminals. It's been about optics. It's been about showing who holds the power and who doesn't. And then they spin the aftermath. They call victims illegals. They accuse Congress of sympathizing with criminals. They attack witnesses. They imply families are lying for attention. They claim advocates are radical left activists. They do everything they can to delegitimize the truth because truth is lethal to their agenda. And this is where the authoritarian blueprint becomes impossible to ignore. Authoritarianism doesn't begin with tanks in the streets. It begins with citizens being snatched off sidewalks by agents with no badges. It begins with churches being monitored. It begins with families disappearing into detention centers. It begins with the government deciding who is deserving of rights and who isn't. And then, slowly, predictably, the definition of undeserving widens. Maybe you think this will only ever apply to immigrants, but look at the last few years. The same people cheering these raids are the ones trying to gut voting rights, criminalize protests, ban books, silence journalists, and punish political enemies. Do you really think it stops with immigrants? Do you really think the power to detain people without due process only gets used once? Power expands. Power always expands. And the LA raids are not just a warning, they are a preview, a test run, a demonstration of what a second Trump term looks like when the guardrails are weaker and the stakes are higher. If federal agents can grab citizens today with no badges, what can they do tomorrow with full political cover? If communities can be terrorized now without consequences, what happens when the courts are packed with loyalists who won't intervene? If Congress can only react after the fact, what happens when they lose the ability to check this behavior at all? The pattern is undeniable: secrecy, brutality, denial, repeat. And the LA raids fit perfectly into that cycle. They weren't random. They weren't accidental. They were a calculated show of force meant to signal that Trump's immigration machine is back, bigger, harsher, and less accountable than ever. And the heartbreaking truth is that the people who testified aren't outliers. They're test cases. They're the canaries in the coal mine. They are the early warnings of what happens when a leader decides the Constitution is optional, due process is negotiable, and rights are conditional. If you're still wondering whether this is a pattern, consider this. Every authoritarian regime throughout history has relied on the same formula: define an enemy,
justify cruelty against them, expand the definition of enemy, and use fear to control the rest. And every time people say, it can't happen here, until it does.
And this is the point where we have to stop pretending that this is just about Los Angeles. Because what we are looking at is not a local problem. It is not a West Coast anomaly. It is not a California issue. It is a warning shot to the entire country about where this movement is headed. And the people who still think this won't touch them, people who say things like, well, I'm a citizen, or I have nothing to hide, or they would never come for someone like me, those people are living in a fantasy. Because the line between who is targeted and who is next is not a line these guys respect. It's a suggestion. And when power is unchecked, suggestions disappear fast. This is the part that should terrify every single American. The exact tactics used in LA are the ones used historically to normalize state force beyond public oversight. The masks, the unmarked vans, the denial of lawyers, the refusal to show badges, the secrecy. This is the toolkit. This is the authoritarian starter pack. And once it becomes normalized, once people collectively shrug and say, well, that's just how it is now, you don't get your rights back. Ever. Look at how quickly it's spiraled already. At first, they were targeting criminals. Then they were detaining bystanders. Then citizens. Then people filming from the sidewalk. Then churches were forced to lock their doors. Then entire families disappeared into detention centers. That didn't take years. It didn't take decades. It happened in a matter of months. What do you think happens in a matter of years? What do you think happens when this model expands to other cities, other states? What happens when this becomes the norm?
Here's the reality they're hoping you never grasp. The LA raids were a stress test. A test to see how much power they can grab before people push back. A test to see if they can operate without transparency. A test to see if the public will accept federal agents detaining citizens without due process. And based on the administration's reaction, they think they passed that test. They think the fear worked. They think the silence worked. They think the trauma will keep people quiet. And that should scare the hell out of us. Because once fear becomes the governing principle, democracy stops being democracy. A democracy where citizens are afraid to walk outside, afraid to attend church, afraid to go to work, afraid to record the government, afraid to even ask for a lawyer, that is not a democracy. That is a country performing the motions of democracy while the substance rots underneath. Make no mistake, if this goes unchecked, it won't stop with immigration. It won't stop with Los Angeles. It won't stop with raids. Authoritarian rule always grows outward. It moves to protests, to political opponents, to journalists, to voting rights, to anyone who threatens their control. And the same people saying, good, they're finally cracking down, will eventually realize they handed the government a weapon that does not have a safety switch. And here's the part that pisses me off the most. They're counting on people being overwhelmed, exhausted, numb. They're counting on citizens tuning out, thinking this is just another scandal. It's too complicated. There's nothing I can do. That's the goal. Exhaustion is the strategy. Chaos is the environment where authoritarianism spreads the fastest. Because when people stop paying attention, when they stop fighting back, when they stop speaking up, power fills the vacuum. And not the kind of power that respects rights or dignity.
But this is where the hearing mattered, because it shattered the silence. It forced the issue out of the shadows and onto the congressional record. It took private trauma and turned it into public accountability, and that matters. That's the first step towards stopping this, because information is power. Receipts are power. Testimony is power. And the more sunlight hits these operations, the weaker they get. The stakes here aren't theoretical. They're not abstract. They're not policy debates. The stakes are human lives. The stakes are families ripped apart. The stakes are citizens detained without cause. The stakes are precedent, because once the government claims the right to detain citizens under the guise of security, you don't get to undo that precedent. It becomes permanent. It becomes the new normal. And for anyone who cares about democracy, that should be unacceptable. We have to be brutally honest about where this path leads. It leads to a country where fear becomes policy, where law becomes selective, where the government decides which communities get constitutional rights and which don't. Where entire groups of people live in the shadows because they're afraid that visibility is a risk. Where the machinery of the state answers not to the law or the courts or the people, but to the whims of a leader who sees accountability as a threat. If you think that sounds dramatic, look around. Look at what's already happening. Look at what people just testified under oath. Look at what the administration denied in the face of overwhelming evidence. This is not speculation. This is not hyperbole. This is reality, happening right now. And the only reason it isn't worse is because people are speaking out, because communities are resisting, because Congress, for once, did its job and listened.
The endgame here is simple. Either we confront this now while we still can, or we wait until we can't. These are the moments where democracies either fight for themselves or fold, and folding is not an option. Not when people are already being thrown to the ground by masked agents. Not when children cry themselves to sleep because their father never came home. Not when churches lock their gates in fear. Not when citizens disappear into federal custody. Not when the truth is staring us in the face so loudly it cannot be ignored. If you're watching this and you feel angry, good, you should. If you feel horrified, good, you should. If you feel like this is not the country we're supposed to be, you're right. And if you're wondering what comes next, here it is. Vigilance, outrage, pressure, calls, votes. Eyes on every raid, every operation, every story, because sunlight is the enemy of this machinery. Accountability is the enemy of this machinery. And the one thing they cannot survive is a public that refuses to be bullied into silence. The LA hearing didn't solve the problem, but it exposed it. And now the question isn't whether this happened. It did. The question is whether we're going to let it happen again, whether we're going to shrug and move on, or whether we're going to demand a country where no one, not one single person, has to fear being disappeared by their own government. That choice is ours, and time is running out.